Welcome to the Climbing Lifer podcast. This podcast is for climbers who have gone 40 times around the sun, want to go a lot more, and want to have a lot of climbing for the rest of their lives. And so I'm your host, Don McGrath, creator of the Climbing Lifer podcast. And today I'm just so super excited because I have a tremendous guest on, a guest that I wish I had a chance to meet when I was in New York a couple of months ago. We had a near miss, and I'm just so excited to have connected with him and have him on the podcast today. So Rich Goldstone has been climbing for over 62 years, is a former math professor, has climbed all over the country. He's a Gunks legend, and I can't wait to talk to him about some beefs that I have with some climbs that really wrestled me, that he had a hand in putting up. And so welcome to the podcast, Rich.
Thank you.
So I'd like to know how did you get started? Like, how did you get started climbing?
I got started with the Exum guides in 1957. My parents sent me off on a cross-country camping, station wagon camping type trip. And the trip stopped in the Pitons, and was part of the activities. Was a climbing school, and then a guided ascent of the own Spalding route on the Grand. All the other kids hated it, and I fell in love immediately and forever, apparently. So that was 1957.
So this was
14 years old.
Inadvertent. So it's kind of like a side trip kind of thing? Like, did you know you were going to do this, or did you just kind of fall in?
Well, I think we knew that this thing was part of the whole experience, but I had no idea what it was going to be about, and my parents certainly didn't know. So it was a completely random thing that happened that struck me so powerfully.
And was it love at first climb? I mean, it was.
Like,
wow, I just can't wait to do this again.
It was love at first. So the first thing, I don't know if I can even it's hard to describe, but we went to the practice rocks in the Tetons, and there was this thing that they call I think they call it the bathtub pitch. It's a little friction slab. And the guide at the time, a guy by the name of Bob French, walked up this thing. And I had this immediate reaction just watching him sticking to this slippery slab, that it was something I wanted to do. Really right on the spot. I saw him do this, and I just had this tremendous urge, like, this is something I want to do too. It was immediate. It was absolutely instant. And it didn't come from anything in my family. My family was not outdoorsy. We didn't hike. There was none of that in my family background. Must have been in the genes somewhere.
Yeah, it does. A random act of unbelievable luck that you crossed paths with climbing. And so then what happened? How did you pursue that?
Well, so I'm 14 years old, right? And I don't know any climbers and I was extremely naive about the whole thing. So I just assumed that the Tetons was the only place in the world where you could go climbing. And I convinced my parents to send me on other trips for a while. And then as a senior in high school, I went by myself, which also amazes me that they let me do that. So I spent a couple other years going out to the Tetons. I used the Exum guides again. I did a few more climbs up. I did the Exum route on the Grand. I did the East Ridge of Mount Owen. And I did the Southwest Ridge of Symmetry Spire with Barry Corbett, actually, which is actually a real rock climb. And then I decided, hey, I know how to climb now. And that was after 3 or 4 years. And I started doing it myself and somehow managed to survive that.
And so little did you know that, you grew up in Manhattan.
Mm-hmm.
So you grew up in the kind of concrete jungle of New York. And little did you know that an hour and a half away was the Gunks.
No idea. I had no idea the Gunks were there. And my trajectory took me to the University of Chicago, and I started what I guess you would call more serious rock climbing at Devil's Lake. And at that point, I learned that the Gunks existed, actually, and came back to the Gunks. But during that 3 or 4 years as a high school when I was in high school, I had no idea they were there, and I didn't know anything about how you would go there. I didn't know anything about how to get into climbing, really. I was reading a lot of books, but they were all about Europe. You know, I was reading Herman Buell and Gaston Levi.
Right. So you go away to school climbing in Wisconsin. It's Wisconsin. Devil's Lake is
Devil's Lake, right?
Wisconsin, and then you find out there's the Gunks. So when did you start climbing? How did that transpire? Did you move back to New York?
No, we started coming to the Gunks on. We made some trip. So I was coming home, but other people were coming from Chicago. We made some winter trips to the Gunks while I was still in college. And the first time I came to the Gunks, though, was actually 1961, I'm pretty sure. So I was still a senior in high school. It was that same year when I loaded up a duffel bag and went out to the Tetons on the Trailways bus by myself. And that was a fantastic experience. And that was the first time I went to the Gunks, the very first time. And it was a very different place then, of course.
Do you remember what you climbed? Do you remember?
Oh, yeah. I remember very well. So I think I came with a guy by the name of Bob Lustenberger, which is a great name for a climber. I've totally lost track of him. And there was no guidebook, of course. And so this was in 61. I think Art Grant maybe was 64. Well, I don't know, a couple of years later. There was no guidebook. And it was midweek, so there wasn't any climbers there. So we didn't know. We walked along the cliff looking for something that looked like we could climb it. You know, it wasn't, I had a couple of years experience in the mountains, so I could climb stuff, but I really didn't know that much about serious vertical rock climbing. And the Gunks, it was a foggy day. They were towering up into the mist. They could have been 1,000 feet high. It was very impressive. And we found something and looked like we could maybe do it. And, so we tentatively started up and kept going, and got to the top. It turned out to be 3 Pines.
Excellent. Classic.
So, yeah, it turned that, subsequently, that's what I found out we had done. And it was a fantastic experience. And of course, and then we got to the top and didn't know what to do and managed to find our way back down. And the whole thing took the whole day. I mean, there's a little bit of route finding on 3 Pines. If you don't know where it goes, you have to walk to the right on that ledge, for example. So we were a little puzzled at various points. It was a huge adventure, the kind of thing that's not available to modern climbers in a popular area anymore. And certainly continued to get me stoked on climbing for sure.
Well, I mean, from there, you just really took it to a new level, just climbing. Once you kind of got back so you can climb consistently there, you just climbed all the time there, right?
Eventually, when I moved back, yes. But after I moved back in, I don't know when that was, 66 maybe, 65, 66. Yeah, then I was at the Gunks as much as I possibly could. I was working, but I was certainly there every weekend. And I was originally working as a high school math teacher, so every weekend and all the breaks. In the summer, I went out west. So I climbed a lot there.
What was going on in the Gunks at that time? Well, give us a feel for what the community was like there, what it felt like to climb there.
It's so hard to sort of describe it compared to now. It was another world. It was the end. I came in at the end of the Appy era. Basically, the Vulgarians had basically won the battle. So some of what some people may have heard about the Appies controlling everything was not happening. But it was still, it was a very much smaller group of people. I was lucky to fall in with the Bulgarians right away so that I had people to climb with and mentors, I should say, to keep me from getting myself killed rather early in the game. But I would say that nowadays a typical weekday has more people out there than a popular weekend would when we were going. And if you went out during the week, the chances are very good you wouldn't see anybody. So much smaller. No rappelling whatsoever. everybody walked back along the top. And something that made this reasonable and may have been the reason why things changed was that you parked along 4455 next to the railing, and you sort of geared up at your car, you grabbed your rack and all that stuff, and walked to the climb. Nothing left at the bottom of the climb because you were walking back, so you weren't rappelling down. So, you know, all of those things made it pretty different. Of course, when I first started, it was the Piton era, it was the Iron Age. So no, we weren't using nuts and cans either.
So I'd like to hear what is your favorite Vulgarian story? I mean, some people have heard of the Vulgarian, some people haven't heard of the Vulgarian. So just give us a sense for what that was like and maybe one of your favorites.
You know, the Vulgarians do a little self-promotion too. So
they probably named themselves, right? I guess that
they named themselves among other things. I don't know if I have a favorite Vulgarian story, frankly. I mean, there was, you know, sex, drugs, and rock and roll was definitely part of the Vulgarian ethic.
With some climbing thrown in.
And frankly, by the time I got there, that was pretty much the order. I mean, I think many of the Vulgarians had left the field of battle, or you know, some were left, like Dick Williams, who of course stuck around for a long time. But many of the others, people like Roman Sadoe, wasn't climbing anymore. Claude Sewell was relatively inactive at that point, I think. Dave Kraft was starting to fade out. So I came sort of at the end of that. Of course, McCarthy was still very active, and he was not exactly a Vulgarian, although certainly hung out with him. Art Grant, I think, maybe was starting to fade out a little bit as well. But I think the thing about the Vulgarians that it's not exactly a story, but you know, they had a reputation for various things. I think one of the things people don't understand is how incredibly accepting they were. I mean, I showed up as some, you know, college kid, and I'm on the carriage road doing boulder problems because I, you know, hung out with John Gill and thought bouldering was a good thing. And these guys just walked up to me and, you know, and invited me to climb with them, basically. You know, something that doesn't happen. There isn't a way for that to happen even today. But, you know, I just immediately invited to be part of that group, and then immediately benefited from all the expertise that was there. People like Art Grant and Jim McCarthy. So that's not exactly a Vulgarian story. I know you were hoping for more of the sex, drugs, and rock and roll.
I don't know what I was hoping for. That's a great one. Actually, it's a great lesson that I think we can all learn from today. There's a lot of division in various communities in the climbing community, and I think we can all benefit from that spirit of inclusivity, right? You see somebody hanging out, you know, reach out to them and
invite them, right?
Invite them along, right?
Just invite them along. That's what. And then they invited me to their parties, and they invited me to their house. And you know, you just immediately, if you could, I think at one point Art Grant said, if you can take it, you can be a member. Well, you know, so taking it didn't actually mean that you had to keep up with the partying or the sex, drugs, and rock and roll, but you had to be okay with it.
You got to show up, right? You,
you had to show up. Right? So, right, if you weren't okay with it, well, then you weren't going to be a Vulgarian. But you know, the famous things like the Vulgarians urinating on the volunteer firemen from the roof, that was a little before me. Maybe another Vulgarian thing is when I went to the Pitons in 61. So that was when I was a high school senior. I really incredibly naive, no partners. I went out to the Pitons. I'm camping at the climbers campground because they had a climbers campground then. And the Vulgarians were there. I didn't know any of them. I hadn't met any of these people yet. And I was just utterly scandalized at Vulgarian behavior. I mean, they were racing their triumphs around. They were lounging in various stages of nudity. They were copulating in the woods. They were getting drunk, and they had blowing the Vulgarophone, which was a 60-foot piece of pipe with a coffee can on the end, which they then lit, poured gasoline into and lit. And, you know, and I've been reading Gaston Rébuffat, and, you know, and had, you know, matching knicker socks and sweaters. So I thought the apocalypse had come to the climbers' campground, and this was actually the end of days. So it was a revelation. Like 3 or 4 years later, to be actually part of the same group.
Yeah, that's kind of funny, right? But that part of that is that accepting nature. I mean, they welcome you in. Well, I would like to give a quick shout out to one of our sponsors, Sharp End Publishing. You can find all of their books at sharpendbooks.com. They carry tons of guidebooks, tons of books about climbing. They carry one of my books. Myself and Jeff Ellison wrote Vertical Mind, which is about mental training for climbing. And I can't say enough about what a help that Fred and Heidi Knapp have been to Jeff and I, getting our message out in Vertical Mind. So if you have a climbing trip coming up, go to sharpendbooks.com and see if there's a guidebook there. It's a guidebook. It's a book company by climbers for climbers. So go there, see what guidebooks they have. If you don't have a trip, go there anyways and see the guidebooks they have, and that'll inspire you to plan a trip. That's one of the reasons we climb, right? Is to go have adventures. In Vertical Mind, you can also find Vertical Mind on sharpendbooks.com or on Amazon. So Rich, so the Vulgarian time, it was a pretty big shift in climbing in the Gunks, which actually had a ripple effect in climbing in the country, right? You talked about the advent of bouldering. You talked about some of the difficult routes that were going in at the time, bringing a more athletic type of climbing for that area and that style of climbing. So tell us maybe a story about that. I mean, what's a story that you have around that really struck you like, wow, we are really advancing things?
Oh, gee. I mean, it never occurred to me that I was advancing anything, frankly. And as far as sort of a more gymnastic approach to climbing, I think it's fair to say that at least in the Gunks, that was Dick Williams' contribution. I was amazed when I got to the Gunks and saw Williams, making all these very, very dynamic moves. Gil was the only other person I'd encountered who climbed that way. And it seemed to me that Williams was in the same category in terms of launching himself on various things. But in terms of doing something groundbreaking or doing something new, honestly, I'm not trying to be modest. It didn't occur to me that we were doing. I just thought that we were carrying on in the tradition, and some of the climbs we did were a little bit harder, obviously, but to some extent we didn't realize till they got graded later how much harder they were, because
we'll come back to that one in a little bit, because I got a personal story around that.
Okay.
So you said you came you started there in the age of the Pitons and the age of iron.
Yep.
And you did put up the first all-nut ascent in the Gunks, I believe, right?
That's true.
And that was, tell us about that. What was that like?
Sometime around 1967, Royal Robbins wrote an article for Summit magazine, now defunct, which was entitled "Nuts to You." And Robbins had discovered that there was climbing in Great Britain, and I'm being facetious, but had gone over there, done a bunch of climbs, and of course all the British climbers were using nuts, and he became enamored of the concept, as of course everyone eventually was, and he wrote an article about it. And so what you did, as directed by the article, is you sent $15 off to Joe Brown, who had a store in Wales, and Joe Brown sent you a little box with nuts. And you got nuts, and you got webbing. You got about 15 nuts. They were, they were just a mishmash of different shapes and things, but not that much variation in size, right? Mm-hmm. So not as much variation as just a set of stoppers nowadays, and no gradation or whatnot. Just randomness. Anyway, we threaded these up and said, okay, Robin says we should be doing this, so we should do it. So we immediately realized that you couldn't place the damn things anywhere in the gunks because all the horizontal cracks with no taper in them. So I started thinking about, well, where could we use them? And it occurred to me the double crack, which has a lot of vertical cracks and lots of tapering vertical cracks, would be a good bet. So Dave Kraft and I, left our pitons behind and our hammers, and went up there with Joe Brown's 15 nuts, and by God, we did it. Now, and it was very interesting at the time because pitons make noise when you're climbing; they clank and whatnot. And while we were up there, people walked by on the carriage road, didn't notice us or anything as they normally would have because we were completely silent because we had these nuts that didn't make any noise. So that was exciting and eye-opening, but it still didn't convince us, and indeed it wasn't for quite a few years, that you could climb in the gunks with only nuts.
So were they aluminum or were they?
They were aluminum.
They were aluminum.
Different,
shaped like a chalkstone or shaped like?
Oh, some of them look like stoppers, the same wedge shape as stoppers. Some of them look literally like machine nuts with the threads on the inside filed down so it wouldn't cut the sling so badly if you fell on it. Some of them, they mostly look like that, but Chenard came out. Chenard really made things a lot better because he made everything. He normalized and regularized everything and got a graduated set of shapes and whatnot. These were just all over the place. So you didn't know what you should be grabbing, for example. The other thing is, I don't know why, but the Brits wore them like necklaces. They wore them on short slings so that they hung like down here, which was insane as far as I could tell. First of all, if one of them caught, it would jar it.
Yeah, it wouldn't be good, right?
Right. Second of all, the minute you lean forward, you wouldn't see anything because this whole stupid 15 nuts were hanging in your face. So we got rid of that pretty quick. And of course, none of them were on wire, right? They're all on webbing, and the small ones had to be on very tiny pieces of webbing or very thin pieces of cord, 6mm cord or something.
So this last trip back to New York this fall, I got on a route that I got on many years ago when I used to live in New York, and this route, Coexistence, was my nemesis when I lived in New York. It was like one of the 510s that every year it seemed like I would try it, and every year it would spit me off. I finally did it when I was in New York, and I went back this last trip and I did it again. And
good for you.
And the thing is, what struck me is it's the best 511 and one of the best 511s in the gunks. Like I was joking with you. The trouble is it's graded like 10C or something. So I'd love to hear about, when that route went in, what led up to it, and a little story around that. Who were you with?
Well, this was a productive 2 weeks that I had that in the gunks, and it's one of the few. I'm pretty bad about dates in my life, but for some reason I know this was 1967, and it all happened because of McCarthy. So McCarthy had his eye on some aid routes. And at this point, he was like enlisting the younger generation for possible rope gunning duties. So the first thing we did was try again, which we just went up and did. It wasn't a big production, but it had aid in it before.
Which is pretty hard too.
It's pretty hard.
Yeah.
Right? It's pretty hard. This is still Piton age, by the way. And a piton that I placed over the lip on that try again ceiling was there for many, many years. And maybe some replacement for it is still there. I don't know.
There is one that, it's
over the lip, right?
Yeah. It keeps you off that ledge, I think.
Right. Oh yeah. Without that, it would be pretty scary. And so that, emboldened by that success, McCarthy said, well, now we have to do Coexistence. So it was definitely McCarthy's idea. Well, Coexistence was obviously a bit harder. But it was very well protected, right? And I was bouldering at the time at, much like V4, somewhere between V4 and V7. So So it shouldn't have been that bad, right? So I went up and fell off. Now, one of the reasons I fell off is I had to hang on putting pitons in, and I got really tired. McCarthy went up and fell off. I went up and fell off. McCarthy went up and fell off. I went up and made it, basically. So, so when in keeping with the old school style, when we fell, you had to lower to a hands-off rest, which is actually pretty close. If you remember Coexistence, you can stand.
It's like a ledge.
This is like a ledge
off the ground or something, right?
Well, oh no, you don't have to go down to that. There's a hands-off rest, maybe.
Oh yeah, the slopey is like a slopey.
Yeah, 15 feet below the. I'm not sure anymore because I haven't been up there in quite maybe 20 years. But anyway, you know, we lowered off at least each time, and I made it. And I also missed some holds, so what I did is even worse than the actual climbing. And you know, that was the era when there was no subdivision that we were using yet of grades, but there was 510, and nobody was going to speak about 511. So we said it's 510 plus.
Yeah, it's a fantastic route. I mean, it's so cryptic when you're below that at the big place where those pitons are, and you just really can't see any of the features. It's brilliant that way.
Well, I miss, as I say, you probably know, I'm assuming you know, because I later learned that there's like a very good sharp crimp over the.
Oh, right.
Yeah. I didn't do it. I missed it.
So it was probably 11 plus.
Did it without that, yeah.
But it is a test piece. I mean, it's for the aspiring 510 leader. It's typically one of the last ones to go.
Yeah. I mean, not that I care, but I sort of got gypped, right? I could have done a 511 in 1967, but nope, it's 510D.
So then you continued to climb and continue to climb. You got your profession. You were became a math professor. Mm-hmm. Have a family, and tell us how climbing. How has that shifted for you over the years?
Well, climbing is a passion, but it has never been the only one. I've been in love with mathematics and with photography and with my wife and daughter, all sort of, and have always tried and wanted to balance that. When my daughter was born, I scaled back on certain aspects of climbing, the more dangerous ones. I haven't soloed since she was born, for example. And I used to do a lot of solo climbing before that. And I think, that was fun. I did a lot of it.
I want to be around.
We could stop now.
We could stop now.
I was a working schmo. I had to go to work every day. I had to prepare classes, grade papers. And I had a long commute as it was. So I climbed less. There's no question that I did a lot less climbing. But the love was always there, and I never stopped. I never actually ever stopped. There wasn't a year when I didn't climb. Maybe my least active year, maybe I only climbed 20 or 30 days. I don't know, something like that. That would have been, real. But I always did it because I always loved it. But certainly there was certainly a scaling back. There's no question about that. And then when you get older, you scale back in other ways because your body can't do what it used to be able to do. So I've had to live with those things as well.
And were there times when you said, well, this year I'd like to do more than I did last year and get back into a little bit more? There have been ebbs and flows, or?
Sometimes I thought that way, but honestly, only now that I'm retired is there a reasonable possibility of doing that. In other words, getting back into it more intensively means more time devoted, and the time wasn't there while I was working. I've only been retired for about a year now. Now the time is there, and I'm somewhat interested in doing better than I have been able to do, but it isn't an enormous goal or anything like it's not like, for example, it'd be kind of nice to do Coexistence again. I haven't done, I used to do it about every 10 years, but I haven't done it in 20. I could probably follow it. I don't know if I can read it. That would be cool, for example, but if it's not a goal at this point. Frankly, you know, when you get to be in your mid-70s, which I am, it's a good day when you wake up and can do whatever you want to do.
Yeah, feet hit the floor, upright, taking nourishment, check.
That's right. So, you know, gratitude for the ability to move and be active and have a functioning mind means that maybe you don't need to have enormously challenging goals. So I still like to make trips and go climbing and do hard stuff.
That's a great segue to the next sponsor spot. It's
okay.
It's actually the first book I ever wrote was titled 50 Athletes Over 50. And I interviewed 50 athletes over the age of 50 doing all kinds of sports because I was 46 at the time and I wanted to be one of those athletes over 50 still at it. And I learned a lot from interviewing those athletes. But one of the main things that I learned was it stops being about performance at some point. And it starts being more about just loving the fact that you can move your body and tap into the passion that you've had. And exactly what you were talking about, Rich, is, you know, at some point that becomes the overwhelming reason why we keep doing it. So if you want to know more about that, if you're interested, if you want to be an athlete over 50 and you're in your 40s, or if you know someone who is an athlete over 50, what I found is a lot of people buy these for gifts for athletes that they know that are over 50, because you know, it's quite a testament to still being at it. So you can find this on Amazon.com, and it'd be great if you got one.
So well, I'm 5 years over 50 at this point. So I'm now above, past that.
Yeah.
But I think what that's right. At a certain point, and this makes it tricky because modern climbing has become increasingly about performance. And I think if that's, I'm interested to see how climbers age, because if performance is what has always drawn you, then a time is going to come when you're not going to perform at the same level. And then that'll be an interesting point for a lot of people, I think, whether they find something about it that they like anyway.
Yeah, I was just interviewing Matt Samet from Boulder yesterday for this podcast, and he's in his 40s, and he said that one of the things he's found is he just needs to stop comparing himself to his younger self, because it just, things change. I mean, so many things change. Your career, work, injuries. You know, one of the other things that I found from interviewing 50 athletes over 50 was it's really important to avoid getting injured, because you got to claw your way back. And
oh yeah, tell me about it. I've been through that too. That's for sure.
What's your injury story, Rich?
Very, very, very little injuries. I've been extremely, extremely fortunate. In fact, the reality is I only have one injury that actually ever amounted to anything. I snapped a tendon type thing in my finger, but I didn't even stop climbing because of that. But about 7 years ago, I jumped off a boulder problem in the gym. I don't think my feet were were maybe at eye level. And I landed in a sort of straddle position, because that's where I was, my climbing position. I landed in a straddle position on the mat. My ankle rolled in and I ruptured the ACL, completely ruptured it in a knee. So I had to have surgery and fix that up. And it was like a long recovery time, right? I was 68 at the time. By the way, I sort of decided I was going to retire from bouldering at that point.
That was an informed decision, right?
Right. Yeah. Right. So I didn't think I needed to subject my knees to any more of that. But the business about not comparing yourself to your former self, that's kind of hard. But there's a more intrinsic problem, which is, I mean, it's easy to say that, but your brain still thinks you're 30. And there's some real danger in that you have to learn to manage. because the brain thinks you can pull as hard as you could when you were 30, and the brain thinks you have the endurance, and the brain thinks all of these things, and they're not true.
They're just not true.
And it doesn't learn. That's the interesting thing to me. It doesn't learn. You have to tell it, but it's a very conscious thing. The brain still thinks you can do all that.
The thing that teaches you that is having a number of injuries. And then you start saying, I know I can't I can't climb as often. I need more recovery.
Yep.
I have to work my way up. If I'm going to push myself, I have to work my way up rather than, just throw myself at something.
Oh yeah. I used to go into a gym. I mean, this was before climbing gyms, but I used to work out hard every single day, like 5 days a week. That's crazy. I mean, and something hurt me for like 30 years. For 30 years, something was always hurting. Nuts. It was just stupid. But you got to learn. Eventually that should penetrate your consciousness that you're not doing it right.
Yeah. So you got to climb with some amazing mentors. So I'd love to hear a story about one of your mentors and an experience that just stands out in your mind.
Oh boy. I think of course there's a lot. I think the person that I learned the most from would have been Jim McCarthy. And he came from a tradition. Well, I mentioned the accepting nature of the Vulgarians, but he also came from a tradition in which mentoring had mentoring as a feature. I don't think that's part of a modern climbing. He himself was, Hans Kraus took him under his wing when Jim was a young climber. And there was an idea that this was something you did. So I'll tell you a story about it's not a mentoring story, but it's certainly a story about showing you, how to deal with a difficult situation. Jim and I and our respective girlfriends at the time, actually his wife Laura and my girlfriend Barbara, did a climb called Steeple Peak in the Wind Rivers, and we got caught in a horrendous storm, rappelling down from the top. And the first rappel from the top got us down to a ledge, and there was tremendous lightning. I managed to avoid the Vietnam War, but I honestly felt that this must be what it's like to be shelled, because lightning was striking, things were exploding everywhere. And it was also snowing and sleeting, and the rock was getting coated with ice. And we do this rappel off this pointy top, right? And we can't pull the ropes. The ropes will not come down. And I remember standing there, at least for a moment, like with my mouth open and no words coming out, like, what the fuck?
We could die, right?
And McCarthy was the complete opposite. McCarthy said, we have got to McCarthy swung into action in the same sense that I'm standing there with like, McCarthy swings into action. He says, we've got to get those ropes down. He grabs some nuts, which were still on cord. He fashions prusik knots out of them. He throws the prusik knots on the rope. Now, frankly, if he had prusik in traditional style up that rope, it would have taken probably half an hour and we'd all be dead. No, he doesn't do that. He hands over hands up the rope and then stops whenever he can and grabs the prusik knots and slides them back up, gets up the rope in, I don't know, maybe 5 minutes. Fusses around with the rappel anchor up there. Actually, this was before we even used rappel rings. So we were threading the rope through webbing directly. And if you didn't have it right, it really wouldn't pull. Anyway, messes around with the rope and comes back down and we pull the rope. And there's more epic stories to go after that, but they're not about McCarthy. They're more about me. That was a lesson in action and in responding to difficult situations that I've never forgot. I don't know that it taught me anything, right? Other than the fact that it wasn't me that had any big response. It was him. but it was it was an enormously impressive experience, and the sort of thing that that's the guy you want to be in the mountains with.
Yeah.
When
Well, so some of those lessons translate in other parts of life. Maybe they don't translate into, something you may never encounter that situation again climbing, hopefully not, but in life. So what I'd love to hear about a lesson that you learned from climbing that you translated into some other aspect of your life.
Well, the first thing I think I would say is I think people, honestly, I'll tell you things, I guess, but I think people make too much of this. I think climbing is a wonderful thing, and it engages the body and the mind and all of those wonderful things. But when it becomes a vehicle for life lessons, I'm skeptical, to be honest. And I'm not only skeptical, but it worries me that it is increasingly being marketed that way, that people, and I don't want to denigrate anyone, but we've got climbing to cure PTSD, and we've got climbing to help with your self-confidence. I feel like that's not what it's about, and it isn't why you should be doing it. Okay, so that's a little rant.
Climbing, just climbing. You just think that,
it's climbing. It has wonderful things. Don't pretend that they transfer so well. My lifetime experience with climbers is they're no better adjusted or whatnot than anybody else. So climbing was so wonderful, it doesn't seem to have carried over. But I think that the thing I've gotten from climbing has nothing to do with difficulty, because actually math is much harder than climbing. So when it comes to difficulty, some other areas seem to, in my life, have been more, have had more content. But the thing about climbing, at least trad climbing, is that you sit there and you sort of think, this happens fast, of course, you think about everything that could go wrong. You do everything you can to guard against what can go wrong. And then you forget about it. And then you don't exactly forget, but then you carry on, right? Mm-hmm. And so I think that idea has, sometimes to my wife's annoyance, has completely suffused my life. I think about everything that can go wrong. I do whatever I can to deal with those possibilities. And then, by God, I get on with it, right? Because at the end of the day, after you arrange whatever protection you can, you're still going to have to make the moves. So that's the one thing I think I've gotten out of climbing.
Yeah, I think there's something to be said about, you only can see just so far ahead of you, and so why worry what's beyond that either, too, right? I mean, when you're on Coexistence, you could only see about 10 or 15 feet, so why worry a heck of a lot what's above that? Once you get 10 feet further, you'll have more clarity about that.
Right, but I think the end, it's the other end to me, is I do worry about what can. I think a lot of people in life and a lot of people in climbing don't worry about what can go wrong, and they're surprised. I don't want to be surprised. Maybe something bad will happen, but I don't want it to be a surprise.
Right. Yeah, at least I was aware that it could happen, right?
But that's trad climbing, right? That's trad climbing. That's climbing.
That's the nature of it. That's right. The nature of it.
But I can't say that I've learned anything, because I tried a boulder problem, 500 times and finally did it. This didn't teach me. As I say, mathematics taught me something about that I maybe carried back over to climbing, but not the other way.
Well, as someone who was an electrical engineer, math to me was like, I was forced to do like that much of it. And it is can be a truly difficult.
Yeah. Well, you had to do a lot of math too, right?
I really
the most mathematical of the engineers.
It was like applied math. I sometimes felt like, am I ever going to worry about circuits? It seemed like all I was doing was.
Yeah. Right.
So another just quick sponsor break. Just once again, want to mention the book Vertical Mind. It's myself and Jeff Ellison, published it through Sharpen Publishing at sharpenbooks.com. And we've had great feedback on this book. In fact, I've actually been out climbing at Shelf Road and had someone quote the book who was climbing next to me. And talk about, as an author, there's nothing better than having someone mention your book without them even knowing. And so that was a really, really fun thing. We have great feedback on this. If you feel like you know, your mental game is holding you back, then Jeff and I share a lot of cognitive science as well as some drills to help you climb more effectively in your mental game. So I'd love you to share a little bit about what you've discovered in your own mental training that you've done throughout the years, your approaches that you've had, so any philosophies on preparation or how you face challenges.
Well, actually, I think I sort of, in a way, I just said that about trying to anticipate what can go wrong and to deal with it as best as you can. There's a lot of mental training. So I don't know. There's a lot of mental training now that addresses basically fear of falling and getting more and more used to the idea of falling, which is critical for both hard tread and almost all sport climbing. But in a funny way, that's not where I come from, although I've done some hard things that I've fallen on.
Yeah.
But I mostly thought about falling as not a good idea, and I try to avoid it.
Try to avoid it at all costs. Right?
Yeah, right. And as you get older, you know if you hit something, you're going to break something. So it's even less good idea than it used to be.
Oddly enough, in surveys that we did, people who hadn't been climbing a long time feared falling. People who had been climbing a long time, it was more of a fear of failure than of falling.
Uh-huh.
They were familiar with the falling part of it. It was this societal or own pressure about the failure and that kind of whole fantasy that we have about not failing.
Yes.
Holds people back.
Yeah, well, I understand that, but that's a performance thing, right? I can't go back in time. I don't think I ever felt that to any real extreme. Maybe I did. It's not a feature of my recent life because I don't have any illusions about it. I can do better, and I try to do better on a daily basis. But I don't have any illusions. I was on Mountain Project in some conversation. Some guy said he didn't do the project that he wanted to do, and it at the end of the year, and it had ruined his whole year. His whole year had been a waste because he hadn't done this thing. And I really couldn't get my brain around that. Like, seriously, you had a whole year of climbing, you had a wonderful year of doing all these things, and it's a waste because
after all, it is just climbing.
It is just climbing.
After all, it is just climbing.
So I'm afraid, I'm not helping you out much in terms of the question.
Maybe
I don't know that I have any, big preparation. I love to get ready for things. Love it. Absolutely love it. In fact, I love to get ready to things I'm never going to do. I read the guidebooks and the descriptions, and I go find photographs, and I know that there's only a 20% chance that I'll ever get to do this, but I enjoy doing it anyway. So I've always been big on preparation.
So now you're retired, and now this next year, is there anything in particular you're excited about or inspired by?
You mean in terms of climbing?
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, not a single thing like, I need to climb 512 again. Nothing like that. Okay, if I climb 512 again, I would be both inspired and excited, but I don't think it's very likely, and it won't matter to me much one way or the other. I am retired, so I'm gonna try to get a little bit better, which mostly means going to the climbing gym more than once a week, which is all I've been able to do. Once a week is maintenance. But I honestly don't, as I say, waking up and being able to think clearly and move effectively is enough of a blessing that, it almost seems like pushing too hard to start asking, in my case, for new higher levels of achievement. But the other thing is that even though I did do a lot of bouldering and I've certainly done a bunch of hard climbing, it's been more from the beginning in the mountains where I started. It's been more about being outdoors than it is about getting up 5'8" or 5'9" or 5'10". It's always been more than that. And so,
any plans to go out into the mountains someplace far away and have some trips?
Yeah, absolutely. Those are the 20% things. I saw a climb in the Pyrenees I'd love to do. I've been thinking about maybe going to the Dolomites. I've never been to El Potrero Chico. I did make a trip. I went out to the Tetons 3 years ago, and after not having been there for maybe 20, 30 years. And this past fall, I went out to the Needles in South Dakota, which is an old stomping ground of mine. Had a fantastic week there. So those are all sort of possible things to do. And maybe I'd like to go to Kalymnos, for example. Everyone keeps telling me there's good sport climbing there.
It's great.
It's great, right?
Yeah.
And those are all up in the air. I just don't know. I mean, I don't know what life will deal me. And if the pieces of the puzzle fall into place, I'll do some of those things. I won't do all of them, obviously, but I'll do some of them. So
climbing almost 63 years, what would you tell someone who's in their 40s looking to be climbing into their 70s? What tips or what advice could you offer?
Well, I have to say that it's great to pretend that you got to. It's great for me to pretend that I got here by virtue of some insight or understanding about how to have a long climbing life. But I look at my friends who are just as active and dedicated, and some of them can't climb anymore. So my advice was, first of all, make sure you have good genes.
You can pick those up at Walmart or at Amazon.
Right. Yeah, that's right. They're on sale this time of year. And make sure, I would say, that you're doing the things you love, because don't make it that I have to do this because I've been doing it for 30 years and it's all I know how to do. And now and now I want to keep doing it. Make sure when you get up in the morning that it's the thing you want to do, actually. I see people sometimes, they seem like they don't really want to climb anymore, but they're still doing it. Because if the joy, the passion, the inspiration, whatever it is that moves you is still there, then that's what you need. And you'll find a way to do it at a level that works for you, either super high. I mean, I'm climbing with people in their mid 70s who are climbing a lot harder than me. So it's quite possible to climb at a very high level, or not so high, but the main point is enjoy the kind of involvement that you want, and make sure it's actually what you do want.
Yeah, I remember
good genes too, please. Right.
In the Good Genes, Amazon on sale, post-Christmas, right. You can get. I remember being in the Red River Gorge, and I had known this person from up in the Gunks, and I saw him down actually at the Red River Gorge, and he was climbing, and he climbed pretty hard, but he was absolutely miserable. I remember him saying to me, "I don't know why I do this anymore." I mean, it's like, wow, we all have free choice. And I love your advice about make sure it's what you want to do.
Right, really.
I look around and I feel that my health has benefited, because in order to climb, I've got to, stay fit, and I've got to stay active and healthy and all of those things. So.
Oh, that's certainly true for me. So, I've done a lot of training and of various types that's been motivated by the desire not only to climb, but in times when I'm busy and can't climb that much, that I'll be able to get to climbing easily when the chances arise, right? And I won't have to, I won't be 40 pounds overweight and weak. So the specter, the delight in the specter of climbing, has kept me fit in a way that I can't imagine I would have ever been otherwise. But that's a benefit of climbing to me, right? It's not the main point is that I still like doing it and still get joy out of doing it. You know, you go out to a place like the Gunks, it's something special that you have to be an old climber to realize. But, you know, if it's a place you've climbed your whole life, you reach up and you grab a certain handhold and you have this moment where my fingers were on this hold 50 years ago. It's the same hold. There's a sense of melding with the landscape and being part of the land that comes from that. And you know, that has nothing to do with difficulty or achievement or any of those other things.
It's just the feeling. So you had a health scare a long time ago that sent you on this a journey, right? Changed the course of your life, I believe.
Yes, it did.
Can you share with us what happened?
So I think this was in the early 70s. I had the flu and I woke up paralyzed from the waist down. Literally got out of bed and fell flat on my face because my legs didn't work. Ended up in a neurology ward with a non-specific viral inflammation of the spinal cord. They now think maybe Guillain-Barré disease. And, you know, in a wheelchair on the neurology ward with a catheter, couldn't even urinate without that. And what the doctor said was, well, most people, this is probably not what you're going to be like for the rest of your life, but most people get a little bit, somewhat better. Not many people get a full recovery. So that's what you're looking at. And up until then, really everything, I mean, I was a working person. I never really did the full dirtbag thing. I was a high school math teacher. But up until then, climbing had been a single consuming passion. And I'm sitting in the wheelchair staring out the window of the hospital thinking, the chances that I'll be able to climb again are not all that good. You know, what the hell am I going to do with my life? Well, so the next thing I realized was brain still seems to be working, thank God. And I did major in math, and maybe I should go to grad school, get a PhD, and try, and you know, and I can teach from a wheelchair if that's what it boils down to. So, by the way, an interesting side to this maybe just occurred to me is, I just remembered this. If you had asked me at that time, I was in my 30s, I guess, what happened, what would you do if all of a sudden you were paralyzed and couldn't climb? I'm pretty sure I would have said I would have killed myself. And because I remember, but I remember the minute it happened, I had, you know, I actually thought, well, I'm certainly not going to kill myself, you know. I had almost the exact opposite to say, let's see what is going to work here, because the old things aren't going to work. Yeah. Well, what happened, of course, is I had a complete recovery. It took about a year. You know, so I was very lucky. I didn't have 80%. I got 100%. But I never went back to the single-minded devotion. First of all, I now had a PhD. I had a whole other career, which I loved, by the way. So there was other passions. But I also never went back to that single-minded devotion to climbing. It was almost as if, you know, you got so much back that you didn't think you would get back, that it's presumptuous to ask for all of it. You know? Yeah. You're looking a gift horse in the mouth, Sparky, if you really think that way. And so, I mean, certainly after that, my life took a different turn, and in my opinion, a much better turn than it would have been if I had just been a sort of climber for the rest of my life. And it was because of that. So in some sense, it was one of the most positive things that's ever happened to me.
You and I have a lot more in common than we may know. I've got my PhD in electrical engineering, and I had been working on it while I worked at GE, and I was climbing a lot. It took me having a really bad fall and spraining my ankle so bad that I couldn't climb for like several months. I actually finished my PhD that semester. So it's really that's a funny thing that, you know, these unfortunate things actually, you know,
have their uses.
They have their uses. Who knows? I probably wouldn't have, I may never have finished. I was climbing so much.
That's right. That's right. Yeah. Climbing probably slowed my PhD down because I went, because I could climb. Actually, that was my guiding period. That was one of the things I did while I was working a PhD as I guided.
Well, Richard, this has been absolutely fantastic. I'm so glad we had a chance
It's a lot of
to
fun.
get to know each other more. I want to climb with you next time I come to New York. I think it would be a kick to go to the McCarthy Wall and do something.
Okay, all right.
Absolutely fantastic stuff. So thank you so much for sharing with us today, taking your precious time and spending it with me today and with everyone who's going to see this in the future.
It was my pleasure.
All right, Rich. Thanks a lot. And I'll have this podcast up in within a couple of weeks. And so stay tuned.
Okay, thank you.
Take care. Bye-bye.